So the first thing, let's go ahead and make a new layer, and we can call this, let's go ahead and call this beams. Now to create the beams, it's really not very difficult to do because all we use is the polygonal lasso. Okay, and so all I have to do is just come in here, and I'll zoom in just a little bit so you can see what's going on. There we go. And I'm going to start on this first. Well, I'll start on this one over here, this last one. And I'm going to want to position that polygonal right there on the corner of the last window, the very top left corner. Click. Then I'll just drag out. And we want to sort of imagine this beam, how beams just almost like when they shoot out of a window, they widen a little bit. It seems like that anyway. But click and then drag it out and kind of go up a little bit, just at an angle, just slightly, like this. And then click and then drag down, click again, and then just return back to the window, but this time I want you to return back to the lower left corner, right here. Then up, and then reconnect the selection, just like that. Okay, cool. Now let's fill that selection in with the beam color that we're going to use. And the beam color is also very easy to pick out. Come over to the foreground color, click on that, bring up the color picker. Then with the color picker, I'm going to select the only web safe colors. That way, again, we just have less colors to work with. And I want you to bring this slider down here to the orange color. You see that? We're switching from yellow to orange. And guess what? You've already got the color. So after you see that, go ahead and click OK. Then over here on the toolbar, we'll select the paint bucket, and then I'll just click inside that selection to fill that in. Select, deselect. Now to get an idea on how this is going to look, let's just come over to the beams layer and lower the opacity just a little bit. And now we can sort of get an idea on what it's going to look like when the light is just shining out of the windows. And I can just readjust this beam if I need to, just to line it up to that window just a little bit better. And so let's go ahead and create another beam. And I think what I'm going to do is just rename this layer here to beam 1, because we're going to create 3 beams of light. I'll create a new layer, and let's call this beam 2. I'll select the polygonal lasso tool, and we're just going to click on top of this one and bring out. Now I'm going to make this go up, or well really I'm just going to make this basically go in the same direction as the other beam, but it'll be a little bit higher just because this window is a little bit closer to us. So in that case, I'm going to make it a little bit wider, just a little bit taller, and then I'll return back to the bottom left corner of that window. I'm going to click and then right up to the top, and then over here on the toolbar, let's select the paint bucket and fill that in. And I'll just select that. And now let's turn down the opacity of that. Now we're not really sure exactly what the opacities are going to be for these beams just yet. I'm just playing around here. It's just so you can kind of get an idea on the progress that we're doing. Let's create another new layer. I'll double click, and we're going to call that beam 3. And now for beam 3, let's select the polygonal lasso here. I'm going to click at the very top of this window and just go up here at an angle and down. And this is just going to be the widest beam so far. And I'll click at the bottom left corner of this window and move that up and connect the selection. There we go. I'll select the paint bucket, and let's go ahead and fill that in. Deselect and lower the opacity. And it looks like I'll just move that beam in just a little bit closer to the window. There we go. Perfect. And so I'll lower that opacity just a little bit more. Okay. Now there's a few things that are missing here, and we're going to go ahead and do those in just a moment. But before I move on, I'm going to show you something really cool. You may or may not have tried this already or even knew about it, but I'm going to go ahead and include it on the video. I'm going to combine these 3 beam layers together in their own separate group. Then what I'm going to do is apply a layer mask to the group. Let me go ahead and show you. If you're using an older version of Photoshop, if you're not using CS2 and you're using an earlier version, what I want you to do is link all these layers together. So in Photoshop CS and earlier, you have the link well that's just next to the little eyeball icon. I want you to add the beam 2 and beam 1 layer here together, so you have beam 3, beam 2, and beam 1 all linked together. Now for those of you that are in Photoshop CS2, just hold down the Shift key, make sure beam 3 is selected, hold down the Shift key, and then click on beam 1, and that'll select all 3 of those layers. Then I want you to come over to the very top. We're going to go into the layers options, so come up to the little arrow at the very top right of the layers palette right here, and I want you to come down here to New Group from Layers. Okay, go ahead and select that, and we'll just call it Beam Group, and I'll go ahead and press Enter. And now all those 3 layers are in their own separate group. Look at that, and I can click on this little arrow and that will expand the group so we can see what's inside of it. Okay, pretty cool. But the greatest thing about this is that we're going to create a layer mask on this beam group right here. So let's go ahead down here to the bottom of the layers palette and click on the Add Layer Mask, and that'll place the mask right next to the group folder. Let's come over here to the toolbar and select the gradient tool, because what we're going to do is make these beams of light fade away. I mean, fade out. They're going to come out of the house as bright as possible, and then they're just going to slowly fade out. Let's look on our completed project here. Do you see how the light just sort of fades off? It just drops off after a little while. I mean, it's pretty bright at the beginning right here, but as you go along, the light just starts to fade away. So that's the type of effect that we're going to create right now. And we're going to be doing it on this layer mask. The layer mask is white, so what we need to do is use black. Let's press DNX on the keyboard to make the foreground color black. I'm going to hold down Shift and then bring that gradient crosshair just outside of the image here. And I want you to click and drag in a gradient. Now, we may have to do this a few times just to get it right, but I'm going to do it right now real quick so you can see what I'm talking about. You see that? Let's go ahead and undo that. And I'm going to bring that just a little bit closer. Click and drag the gradient. I'm holding down the Shift key. Now, if I don't hold down the Shift key with the gradient tool, then it's really flexible like this. And I want to make sure that I'm going perfectly horizontal, so I'm just going to hold down the Shift, and that'll lock it in. And then I'll go ahead and release. Look at that. Now that just looks so much better than it did before. Now it's starting to look more realistic. Now what we can do is adjust the opacities of those beams to really make them look real. And let's go over to that group and expand that. And then I'll go down here and let's just tweak these opacities just a little bit, because I don't want those beams to collide too much, because they really don't need to be that bright. Let me go ahead and zoom in here just a little bit closer, because if the video is a little bit small, I'll zoom in so you can see this. Also, if you notice that the edges of the beams are very defined, it's a very sharp edge. I found that if I blur or soften those edges just a tiny bit, it looks much better. Watch, I'll click on beam 1. Better yet, I'll just make these beam 3 and beam 2 invisible. Well, let's just start with beam 3 for right now. Let's come up here to Filter, down here to Blur, and Gaussian Blur. And this is just a very slight blur, very slight. You don't want to crank this thing all the way up here, because it's just not going to look right. You can do that, but if you want those really cool sharp beams, then you're going to have to keep that radius number way down here. Then what I'll do is just go ahead and click OK. So we're going to use the 1.2. I'm going to click OK. And so we can apply the same value to all the other beams. So I'll click on beam 2, go up here to filter, Gaussian blur, and you'll see that the Gaussian blur is the first thing on the menu here at the very top. And all we have to do is select that, and that'll apply the exact same setting that we used the last time we used the Gaussian blur. So I'll click on beam 1, make that visible, go up to filter, Gaussian blur right here. Great. And that very subtle adjustment there, I feel that just makes a big difference. So let's check it out. Look at that. And there's one other thing that we need to do to make all this look more real than it already does. We're going to create this light on the grass. And if we look over on the completed poster, you can see the light is coming out of the house. The grass there is sort of lighting up a little bit, just because the lights are so bright that the outside of the house is getting light as well. So we're going to go ahead and create that effect right there. And before I do that, I've been looking at the image here, and I noticed that those beams could probably be just a little bit more dramatic. Let me show you something real quick. If we select or link all these beam layers together, we could actually distort them. And what I mean by that is come over here to Edit, Transform, and select Distort. And that'll give us the ability to widen the beams if we want to. We don't have to. But I can come in here and widen those up a little bit. You see, they were a little bit narrow, but I can just come over here and make those much more dramatic like that. Look at that. And then I'll go over here and just click on a little check box or a little check mark at the top, or I can press the Enter key on the keyboard to confirm that. Look at that. Okay, so a lot of the stuff that I'm doing here is kind of like freestyle. A lot of it's improvised. I don't know exactly what I'm going to do. I have to experiment just like everybody else. So, but I think I like this much better. And hopefully you can pick up little tips along the way. And so now let's create that reflection off the grass there. I'm going to create a new layer, and let's call that grass light. There we go. And the grass light is pretty easy to make. All we have to do is select the brush tool and create a soft brush. So we'll right click on the image and make sure the hardness is all the way down. And I'll just set this brush size here a little bit larger. And then I'll just come in here with the paintbrush and I'll paint down like this. Now that looks pretty wild. I'm just going to go ahead and make that brush size just a little bit smaller. And I'm going to experiment. I don't really know if this brush size is going to work for me, but I want to cover the grass. You almost have to imagine the light beams or the grass is picking up the brightness of the beams. That's really what's happening here. And they're not going to be this bright, obviously. We're going to go back and adjust the brightness of it. I can use the eraser and also come back in here and trim that lighting a little bit, just like that. All right, now let's go over to the grass light layer and turn down the opacity. Look at that. And that's how we can get that effect. Now what we can do, we can also come up here to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and we can blur that as well. Widening it, it's making it a little bit wider, but we can blur the paint because if we can't get the brush soft enough, then we can just go ahead and blur it later or after we've painted the light down there. Okay, excellent. There you go. Now we have that reflection. And I can also see it looks like the mountain in the back there is just a little bit bright. I'm going to hold down Control and select the layer mask of this house, select the transparency of that. And what I think I'll do is inverse that selection. Click on the house layer. Let's select levels. And then I'll just darken that background just a little bit more, just so we could barely see the mountain there. There. And let's go ahead and zoom out and look at our work. That's looking pretty hot. Yeah, it looks like the top there, the sky at the very top, is still a little bit bright. So I'm going to go ahead and just double click on the levels for that image adjustment and make that just a little bit darker, just so it'll blend in more with the house, because it looks like it's just a little bit too bright for nighttime. Great.